Number 1. The missing crew of CASIE NICOLE. On 11th April 1990, Nathan Neesmith, his brother Billy Joe Neesmith, his nephew Keith Wilkes, and his friend Franklin Brantley set off from McIntosh County Pier in Georgia to go on a 7-day commercial fishing expedition. Their ship, CASIE NICOLE, had just recently been docked for maintenance. They took it to an uncharted reef off the coast of South Carolina. At some point during their voyage, the ship began to ride low in the water, and it became apparent that it was taking on water and acting sluggishly. The ship's pumps proved to be inoperable, making the situation dire indeed. And as the ship continued to sink further under the surface, the crew desperately tried to bail out the water with buckets. But the ship inexorably dropped further into the water. The crew realized that their radio didn't work either, and they were forced to abandon the ship, cramming aboard the tiny life raft, which turned out to have its own problems in the form of quarter-size hole in it. With the life raft also slowly sinking, all hope seemed to be lost, until a hatch cover from the CASIE NICOLE came floating by, and they climbed aboard that. As they bobbed about at the mercy of the sea, they spied their ship in the distance, and Nathan Neesmith decided to try and swim to it, thinking it held more promise for getting help than floating about on a hatch cover. Nathan eventually made it to the hull of their ailing ship, but as the night fell, he lost the sight of his friends out on the waves upon the hatch. He clung to the hull of the ship as it slowly continued sinking, during which time he saw a freighter in the distance, but had no way of signaling it. This would go on for several days, until he managed to get onto a floating bait box that had broken loose from the boat, where he would remain until he was finally rescued on April 15, 1990, off the coast of Georgia. A search was carried out for the remaining 3 men, but no sign of them was ever found. It was largely assumed that they had been lost at sea, but this conclusion would be challenged by a series of strange phone calls that would be received in the coming weeks. The caller was an unidentified male who spoke Spanish and seemed unable to understand English. Starting about 6 weeks after the disappearance and continuing over the next year, there were 7 calls made in all. 4 were made to Nathan's sister, and the other 3 were made to a man named Doug Tyson, the owner of CASIE NICOLE. The caller would just repeat the phone number, say the name of the person he was calling, and name of one of the missing men, Billy Joe. In the last call, the man said he was going to bring them home. This would be the end of the calls. But there was no further contact from neither the caller nor the missing man. The phone calls led the family to speculate that the men were actually rescued, but were being held captive in a foreign country. To this day, there has been no sign of them, and their whereabouts and the identity of the caller remain unknown. Number 2. The strange case of L'Enfant. In the 1970s, Bashir Khosroji left his native Lebanon and opened up a successful Moroccan restaurant in Washington, D.C. He was living the American dream, but in 1983, he became the target of an insane, non-stop stream of threatening phone calls that came several times a day, every day. In most harassment campaigns, the trolls would get bored and move on to something else, but Bashir would have to put up with these calls for over 9 years. The workers at the restaurant simply referred to the caller as L'Enfant, which meant the child. Sometimes L'Enfant called with death threats. Other times he just swore or get very sexual. He also did characters. He pretended to be a Middle Eastern man, a small black child, and a little girl, just to name a few. He would call the restaurant multiple times, almost every day. During one specially busy period, which lasted for over 4 years, the restaurant received 7,000 phone calls. There didn't seem to be any escape. When Bashir traveled to Philadelphia to visit his sister, the calls kept coming there. Things got so bad that he suffered mental breakdown and committed himself to a psychiatric ward. but the calls continued to his restaurant. The FBI eventually put a trace on the phone to confirm that the calls were coming from different payphones, and at such a frequency that it would have been impossible for one person to be involved. Lawfare was a plot orchestrated by multiple people for the express purpose of driving Bashir insane. Bashir believed that he was the target of Lawfare because of an incident in 1974 when he was in Beirut. The Palestine Liberation Army kidnapped Bashir because they thought he was a spy for Mossad or a CIA agent. He was held in a Palestinian refugee camp where he was threatened daily. After attempting suicide, he was sent to the hospital where he was able to get in contact with his family. They contacted the American embassy and he was finally released. When he was back in the US, Bashir and his sister opened the first Moroccan restaurant in Philadelphia. Once it was successful, they decided to open a second one in Washington. That's when the phone calls started. The calls finally started dying down in the mid-90s. Perhaps Lawfare just couldn't find a payphone anymore. The identity of the caller still remains a mystery. Number 3. Amber TUCCARO. Amber TUCCARO was a 20-year-old and also a mother to a young child named Jacob. She was from Mikisew Cree First Nation in Alberta, Canada. She disappeared in a place called Nisku in Alberta on August 18, 2010. At the time of her disappearance, she was traveling with her 14-month-old son and a female friend of hers. They were all on their way to visit Edmonton. They didn't have a ton of cash on them, so in order to save money, they planned on staying an evening at a hotel in Nisku. A trip to the city of Edmonton was planned for the next day, but TUCCARO couldn't wait that long. She decided to head for Edmonton that night alone and hitched a ride from a man nearby the hotel. She was never seen alive again. When the female friend didn't hear from Amber, she called Amber's mother, who in return called the RCMP. After investigation, police discovered a recording of Amber's last phone call. While an unknown man drove her, Amber spoke to her brother, who was being held at the Edmonton Remand Center. All outgoing calls for inmates were recorded. Unfortunately, RCMP only released a minute of the recording, when the call was 17 minutes long altogether. Here's a recording of the phone call released by the police.
Where are we by?
We're just heading south of Beaumont, or north of Beaumont.
We're heading north of Beaumont. Yo, where are we going? No, this is a... Are you f***ing kidding me? You better not take me anywhere I don't want to go. I want to go into the city. Jeez. Yo, we're not going into the city, are we?
We're going.
No, we're not.
Yes.
Then where the f*** these roads going to?
50th Street.
50th Street. Are you sure?
Absolutely.
Yo, where are we going?
50th Street.
50th Street?
50th Street.
East, right?
Shortly after, the conversation ended and that was the last we heard of her. 2 years later, her remains were found by horseback riders on a rural property near Ladakh County. Following the release of Amber's recording, several women came forward to say they recognized the male voice. One woman said she knew who the person was and that she also had accepted a ride from him in the past. The women reported the man to the RCMP, but nothing much came from their information. Not much information about Amber's case has been made public. Her family remains in the dark about what happened, or where the authorities are with the case. All that's left of their daughter is the voice recording. The case is still unsolved. Number 4. Barbara and Patricia Grimes. On December 28, 1956, sisters Barbara, 15 years old, and Patricia, 13 years old, went to the Brighton Theatre to see the Elvis Presley movie Love Me Tender. The theatre was 1.5 miles from their home. The sisters stayed for the second film, and were expected home around 11:45 p.m. When there was no sign of them by midnight, their mother sent their older brother and sister to wait by the nearest bus stop for their arrival. After 3 buses had gone by, the siblings returned. At 2:15 a.m., their mother reported Barbara and Patricia as missing. Being that these are 2 teenage girls in the 1950s, when they went missing, everyone just assumed they had run off to Nashville to look for Elvis. Even Elvis himself released a statement pleading for the girls to come home. But the worst fears were realized when a construction worker found the corpses frozen and completely naked, lying in a position that suggested they had been thrown from a moving car. Barbara's chest was riddled with shallow stab wounds, none serious enough to cause death. It actually wasn't at all clear what had killed them, and we still don't know. Between the last confirmed sighting of them at the movie theater on December 28, 1956, and subsequent discovery of their bodies on January 22, 1957, there were several unconfirmed sightings of the girls both in and outside the city. Numerous people said that they saw the girls boarding a bus on Archer Avenue heading east into the city after the screening. They allegedly got off the bus at Western Avenue, about halfway to their home around 11:05 p.m. 2 teenage boys said that while they were driving through the neighborhood at approximately 11:30 p.m., they saw the sisters heading east on 35th Street, giggling and jumping out of doorways at each other. At this point, they would have been approximately 2 blocks from their home. A security guard on the northwest side believed he was asked for directions by the Grimes girls near Lawrence and Central Park Avenues on the morning of December 29th. A classmate of Patricia's, eating at Angelo's restaurant, South Archer Avenue on the evening of December 29th, reported them walking past with 2 other unidentified young girls. A railroad conductor reported seeing them on a train near the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in North Suburban Glenview. On December 30 at 5:40 a.m., the owner of the D&L restaurant at West Madison said he had seen both girls, with Patricia apparently too drunk or sick to walk without staggering, accompanied by a suspect, Benny Bedwell. This location was over 5.5 miles from the Brighton Theatre. A clerk at the Claremont Hotel, after viewing the bodies at the mortuary, identified the sisters as having checked into the hotel on this date. On January 1st, 1957, the girls were reported aboard a bus on Damon Avenue. The following week, a night clerk at the Unity Hotel on West 61st Street refused 2 girls a room because of their age, whom he believed were Grimes sisters. 3 employees at the CASIE department store thought they had seen the sisters listening to Elvis Presley music at the record counter. Adding credence to the theory that both sisters had run away to Nashville, a woman reported having met them at a bus station there and accompanied them to a state employment agency to search for work. A clerk at the same agency identified the sisters from the photographs and recalled them using the Grimes name. Now here's the baffling part. The autopsy concluded that due to their stomachs containing the approximate proportions of their last known meal, both sisters had in fact died within about 5 hours of the time they were last seen at the theatre on either the evening of December 28th or early morning of 29th. So how is it possible that they were seen by so many people several hours after their deaths? There were no obvious fatal wounds on either girl's body, and nothing to indicate that they had been drunk, drugged, or poisoned. Despite being very clean, both corpses had various bruises and rodent bites, including 3 puncture wounds in Barbara's chest that may have come from an ice pick. It was later revealed by authorities that Barbara at least had likely had a sexual intercourse around the time of her death, but no evidence of forcible molestation was found. The immediate cause of death was given as secondary shock, resulting from exposure to low temperatures. This brings us to the phone calls. On January 14th, a week before the bodies were discovered, the phone in the house of Patricia's classmate Sandra rang sometime around midnight. Sandra's mother answered, but the caller hung up. The phone rang again a few minutes later. Sandra's mother heard a frightened and depressed voice asking, "Is that you, Sandra? Is Sandra there?" Before she could bring her daughter to the phone, the caller had hung up. Sandra's mother swears that the voice on the other end was Patricia Grimes, even though medical science would later say she had been dead for more than 2 weeks by that point. While there were several suspects, Benny Bedwell was the prime suspect. He confessed to the murders, though there was never any evidence supporting his claim, and he later recanted it. The case of the Grimes sister still remains unsolved. Number 5. Anthonette CAYEDITO. Anthonette lived with her mother Penny and her sister in an apartment in Gallup, New Mexico. On the night of April 6, 1986, Anthonette's mother had gone out drinking with friends at a local bar, as she often did, leaving Anthonette and her younger sister Wendy at home with her babysitter. When she returned home, the girls were allegedly still full of energy and stayed up until around 3 a.m., after which Anthonette ended up sleeping with her mother. When her mother, Penny, awoke that morning, she was surprised to find out that Anthonette was not in the house. She started to panic after checking with every single person in the neighborhood, and nobody saw her. The police and Penny's neighbors searched around the surrounding foothills and found no trace of her. Authorities were almost certain she was kidnapped at the middle of the night. No further leads were forthcoming, and the case went cold. It would not be until a year later when a mysterious phone call would come into the Gallup Police Department and reignite the investigation. The call was placed directly to the police station itself, and on the other end was the voice of a scared-sounding little girl claiming to be the missing Anthonette CAYEDITO. In the call, she tells the police that she is in Albuquerque and pleads for help before an unidentified man's voice can be heard saying, "Who told you that you could use the phone?"
I'm Anthonette CAYEDITO.
Okay, whereabouts in Albuquerque? Hello? Anthonette, where are you? Anthonette? Hello?
It was at first thought that this was merely a prank call, but when the police played a recording of the call to Penny, she was certain that the voice was her daughter's. She said she was specially certain based on the way the girl said her name. However, she did not recognize the man's voice. The police tried to trace the call but were unsuccessful. The call gave her family hope that she may still be alive. 5 years passed and the case gets weirder. When in 1990, after age-progressed photos of Anthonette were released, a waitress in Carson City, Nevada, claimed to have seen Anthonette eating dinner where she worked. The waitress recalled serving a table with a male, a female, and a girl around the age of 14 or 15. She noted that the couple had rather unkempt appearances, possibly from struggling with the girl. The girl apparently dropped her utensils on the floor intentionally, and when the waitress would try to pick it up for her, the girl grabbed her hand. However, she thought nothing of it and went about her business. The male, female, and the girl left the restaurant. As the waitress cleared the table, she noticed a napkin under the girl's plate with a message, "Please help me, call the police." That same year, Anthonette's younger sister Wendy told investigators that Anthonette had been abducted. The night of her disappearance, a man knocked on family's front door and said that he was their Uncle Joe. Since Penny was sleeping, Anthonette decided to answer it. Two men, neither of whom Wendy recognized, grabbed Anthonette and carried her to a brown van as she kicked and screamed. Wendy did not mention this when the investigation began because she was afraid that it would upset her mother. Investigators cleared Uncle Joe, who was married to Penny's sister at the time. This, however, leads them to believe that the abductors knew the family. Other suspects were checked out as well, including Anthonette's estranged father, Larry Estrada, and 2 known sex offenders living in the area, but none of this turned up any solid leads. Interestingly, more and more suspicion was eventually placed on Anthonette's own mother, as she had failed a polygraph test and lied to the police about several minor details and showed other suspicious behavior, such as the purchase of a new sports car shortly before the disappearance, despite the fact that the family was not well off and lived in a poor part of the town. She was also known for her hard partying ways and drinking problem, and authorities began to suspect that Penny perhaps knew more than she was letting on. But unfortunately, she passed away in April of 1999 before any headway could be made into this potential lead. The case has remained unsolved ever since.